skyline of Seattle glowed against storm clouds as Agent Marcus Reyes monitored his target through high-powered binoculars. The Filipino-American FBI agent had spent 18 months tracking a sophisticated nuclear materials smuggling ring, and tonight's operation would finally expose their entire network. "Target vehicle approaching from the south," his partner's voice crackled through the secure comm. "Black SUV, diplomatic plates, right on schedule." Marcus checked his weapon and badge, standard procedure before any major operation. 10 years with the Bureau's counter-terrorism division had taught him the importance of details, especially in operations this delicate. Officer James Wilson sat in his patrol car 3 blocks away, drumming his fingers against the steering wheel. 2 weeks into his transfer from rural Idaho, the big city had him on edge. Every shadow looked suspicious, every face a potential threat. "That car's been sitting there too long," Wilson muttered to his partner, Officer Rachel Torres. "Tinted. Windows, guy just watching. Something's off." Torres glanced at Marcus's unmarked vehicle. "Probably nothing. This is the Port District, lots of night business." "Not taking chances," Wilson decided, flipping on his lights. "Not in my city." The timing couldn't have been worse. As Marcus prepared to give the go signal for his team to move in, flashing lights filled his rearview mirror. Wilson's patrol car pulled up directly behind him, blocking his surveillance position. "Control, we have a situation," Marcus whispered into his comm. "Local PD interfering. Target approaching hot zone." "Hands where I can see them," Wilson's voice boomed through a megaphone. "Both hands on the steering wheel." Marcus complied, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "Officer, I'm a federal agent. My identification is—" "Did I ask you to speak?" Wilson cut him off, shining his flashlight directly into Marcus's eyes. "You've been casing this area for hours. Officer, please listen carefully." Marcus kept his voice calm, despite the urgency. "I'm FBI agent Marcus Reyes. I'm conducting an ongoing counter-terrorism operation, and you're about to—" "FBI?" Wilson scoffed. "Sure you are. Everyone's FBI these days. Out of the car now." Through his earpiece, Marcus heard his team's tension. "Target vehicle 1 minute out. What's your status?" "Officer," Marcus tried again, "you're about to compromise a federal investigation into nuclear materials smuggling. Please verify my credentials." Wilson yanked the door open, grabbing Marcus's arm. "Yeah, right. Nuclear smuggling. Nice story. Hands behind your back." Torres shifted uncomfortably behind her partner. "James, maybe we should check—" "I've got this," Wilson snapped, pulling Marcus from the car. "Sir, you've picked the wrong neighborhood to case. We've had reports of suspicious activity." "The only suspicious activity," Marcus spoke clearly, knowing time was critical, "is about to drive past us carrying enriched uranium. If you don't let me return to my position—" "Listen to these stories." Wilson laughed, reaching for his handcuffs. "Real creative. Next, you'll tell me you're the head of the FBI." The sound of squealing tires cut through the night. The black SUV with diplomatic plates sped past their position, its driver clearly spooked by the police lights. "Target is running!" Marcus's earpiece erupted. "All units respond!" "Officer Wilson," Marcus's voice turned cold, "you just compromised an 18-month federal investigation into nuclear terrorism. I suggest you release me before—" Suddenly, heavy footsteps approached. FBI Assistant Director Chen emerged from the shadows, flanked by tactical team members. "What the hell is going on here?" Chen demanded, his voice sharp. "Wilson, release Agent Reyes immediately." Wilson's face drained of color as tactical teams rushed past, pursuing the fleeing SUV. The reality of his mistake began sinking in as he watched thousands of dollars of surveillance equipment in Marcus's car. "Sir, I was just following protocol." "Protocol?" Assistant Director Chen's voice cut like ice. "Agent Reyes is leading our largest counter-terrorism operation on the West Coast. You were briefed about this operation last week." Through his earpiece, Marcus heard the pursuit unfolding. "Target, Vehicle heading north on Harbour Drive. 2 kilos of weapons-grade material confirmed. Multiple hostile contacts armed and moving. Sir, Torres spoke up, her voice shaking. Officer Wilson is new to the district. Maybe if we'd... New? Chen interrupted. The FBI sent detailed briefings to every precinct. Did you even read them, Wilson, or were you too busy profiling federal agents based on their appearance? The night sky filled with helicopter searchlights as the pursuit expanded. Marcus quickly accessed his laptop, tracking the target through port security cameras. 18 months of careful investigation crumbling because one officer couldn't believe a Filipino man might be FBI. They're heading for the container terminal, he reported, fingers flying across the keyboard. Secondary vehicle emerging from Dock 7. Third vehicle spotted at the north gate. They planned this. They knew we were watching. They used your prejudice as their escape plan. Wilson stood frozen, his handcuffs still dangling uselessly. I mean, how was I supposed to know? Know what, officer? Marcus asked sharply. That Filipino Americans might be federal agents? That we might be protecting this city from nuclear terrorism? What exactly didn't you know? Through the radio, chaos erupted. Second vehicle confirmed. Multiple suspects armed. Third vehicle breaching port security. All units respond. Coast. Guard deploying. Port authority requesting immediate backup. Chen grabbed his phone, dialing rapidly. Get me the police commissioner. Now. Yes, it's about Officer Wilson. He just compromised national security because he couldn't believe an Asian man might be FBI. No, sir, I'm not exaggerating. We have nuclear materials in the wind. Social media was already exploding. Dock workers had filmed Wilson's interaction with Marcus, the clips spreading rapidly across platforms. FBIW while Filipino dumb bad cop nukes cops. Prejudice aids terrorists. Wilson effect. Nuclear bias port security cameras showed the nuclear materials being transferred between vehicles. The operation's carefully laid plans unraveling in real time. Each monitor told the story of how prejudice had aided terrorism. Sir, Torres attempted damage control. We have procedures for verifying federal credentials. Procedures Officer Wilson ignored. Chen cut in. Now we have loose nuclear material and compromised agents. Still think your partner was just... Being careful with his racial profiling, Marcus's team reported increasingly grim updates through his earpiece. Target vehicles splitting up. Multiple escape routes identified. Port exits compromised. Coast Guard assets deploying. Satellite tracking engaged. International alerts initiated. Border security notified. Wilson watched helplessly as his career imploded in real time. His phone buzzed constantly with notifications as the videos went viral, each showing his dismissal of Marcus's credentials, each capturing his assumptions about what federal agents should look like. Officer Wilson, Marcus spoke while coordinating his teams. Your prejudice just helped nuclear terrorists escape. I hope your assumptions about what FBI agents should look like were worth compromising national security. The port erupted with activity as additional FBI teams arrived, their vehicles' lights painting the night in flashing red and blue. Each agent that emerged matched different ethnicities, backgrounds, and appearances, a visual lesson in what federal agents actually looked like. Full port lockdown initiated, crackled through the radio, all containers being scanned, Coast Guard intercepting vessels, airport security heightened, border crossings alerted, nuclear detection equipment deployed. Chen turned to Wilson, his expression cold. You'll be explaining to the Congressional Oversight Committee how your racial profiling helped nuclear terrorists escape. I hope you're ready to become the textbook example of how prejudice threatens national security. Torres looked at her partner with growing horror as the magnitude of his actions became clear. James, what have you done? He's demonstrated why. Prejudice has no place in law enforcement. Marcus answered, his fingers still flying across his laptop as he coordinated the expanding search. Unfortunately, that lesson may cost us dearly. The FBI's Seattle Command Center buzzed with frantic activity as reports flooded in from across the Pacific Northwest. Multiple screens displayed pursuit updates, satellite tracking, and radiation detector readings. Target vehicles confirmed. In 3 directions, Agent Sarah Chen reported, pointing to the tactical map. First vehicle heading north toward Canada. Second moving east on I-90, third spotted south toward Portland. Marcus coordinated with multiple agencies. All border crossings on high alert. Canadian authorities deploying nuclear detection equipment. State patrols establishing checkpoints. Coast Guard monitoring waterways. Wilson sat in a corner of the command center, required to watch the chaos he'd created. His face grew paler with each update. Nuclear material signature detected on Highway 5. Secondary radiation reading near Tacoma Port. Possible third package moving toward Vancouver. Assistant Director Chen addressed the assembled teams. Thanks. To Officer Wilson's prejudiced intervention, we're now dealing with dispersed nuclear material. 18 months of surveillance blown because he couldn't believe a Filipino man was FBI. The tracking screens showed expanding search patterns, 3 main target vehicles, 5 potential secondary vehicles, multiple decoy signatures, scattered radiation readings, compromised port security, border vulnerabilities exposed, international concerns. Growing social media exploded with leaked footage. Nuclear prejudice trending nationwide. Wilson effect going. Viral bias aids terrorism, spreading globally. FBI while Filipino reaching millions news networks picked up the story. Breaking, police prejudice compromises nuclear security. FBI agent profiled, nuclear material lost. Racial bias creates terror risk. Officers' assumptions aid, nuclear smugglers, Marcus coordinated with international partners. Canadian forces deploying along border. Mexican authorities establishing checkpoints, Pacific Fleet moving to intercept vessels, Asian ports on high alert, European agencies tracking connections. The police commissioner arrived, his face dark with anger. Wilson, you're looking at federal charges. National security compromised. Department reputation destroyed. Criminal negligence confirmed. Career in law enforcement over. Torres gave her official statement. I tried warning him about checking credentials. He refused to verify. FBI identification. Professional bias was obvious. Prejudice overruled procedure. Training completely ignored. Satellite imagery tracked potential escape routes. Northern corridor toward Vancouver, eastern path, through mountains, southern route along coast, maritime options, expanding international borders, threatened multiple jurisdictions involved. Critical. Hours lost. The Department of Homeland Security raised threat levels. Nuclear material unsecured. Multiple vectors possible. International borders vulnerable. Terrorist connections confirmed, security protocols compromised, response times, critical public, safety threatened. The National Security Council declared an emergency session as the nuclear crisis expanded. Video feeds showed search operations stretching across 3 states and 2 countries, while radiation sensors lit up across the Pacific Northwest like a deadly constellation. Inside the FBI's mobile command unit, Marcus coordinated multi-agency response teams, his fingers flying across multiple keyboards as data poured in from dozens of sources. The cramped space hummed with tension as each update painted an increasingly dangerous picture. Target 1. Approaching Canadian border, radiation signature confirmed and strengthening, reported Agent Chen from her station. Canadian authorities moving to intercept, but they're reporting multiple decoy vehicles. Target 2, navigating mountain passes, another agent called out. Thermal imaging shows 3 vehicles matching the profile, all showing radiation signatures. They're splitting up on Forest Service roads. Target 3 near Portland has gone dark, a third voice added. Local units lost visual, but radiation detectors are hitting at 3 different locations. They're using the city's infrastructure to mask their movements. Wilson watched from a secure holding area as his actions' consequences unfolded on multiple screens. Each update drove home the magnitude of his prejudice-driven mistake. The officer's face grew paler with each new development. Maritime units tracking 3 suspicious vessels off the coast, came another report. 2 heading north toward Canadian waters, 1 south toward international shipping lanes, all refusing Coast Guard commands to stop. Assistant Director Chen briefed federal authorities, his voice tight with controlled anger. 1 officer's prejudice has compromised 18 months of careful surveillance. The nuclear smuggling network we were about to dismantle has now dispersed across 3 countries. International terrorist connections are activated and responding. We're looking at a potential catastrophic security breach. Satellite tracking revealed expanding threats across the region. Red dots multiplied across digital maps, each representing a possible nuclear signature. Aerial footage showed congested highways as security checkpoints created massive backups. What's the radiation risk to civilian population? Marcus demanded, pulling up environmental data. Minimal at present, a hazmat specialist responded. They're using military-grade containment, but if they decide to go hot, the implications hung heavy in the air. Wilson slumped in his chair, the weight of potential civilian casualties crushing. IMI international response teams reported in rapid succession. Canadian Special Forces deploying along 6 border points. Mexican authorities establishing checkpoints along Pacific coast. Pacific Fleet moving to intercept suspicious vessels. Asian ports implementing enhanced screening protocols. European agencies tracking known network connections. Middle Eastern partners monitoring terrorist chatter. Marcus coordinated with Homeland Security, his voice steady despite the chaos. We need every radiation detector between Seattle and San Diego activated. All major ports and border crossings need enhanced screening. Reroute commercial traffic away from suspected corridors. Get me real-time satellite coverage of every mountain pass. Track every vehicle leaving that port in the last 2 hours. Monitor all private airfields within 500 miles. The screen showed a nation mobilizing. Military units deploying to strategic positions, nuclear detection equipment being airlifted, special forces teams positioning for intercept, air defense systems tracking suspicious flights. Maritime patrols establishing search patterns, ground forces securing potential escape routes, international partners closing their borders. Social media exploded with leaked footage of Wilson's confrontation with Marcus. A nuclear bias trending globally. Wilson effect spreading worldwide. Prejudice aids terror, reaching millions. Where's FBI, while Filipino dominating discussions. Where's bias helps. Nukes gaining traction. News networks ran constant updates. Breaking. Police prejudice compromises. Nuclear security. FBI agent profiled. Nuclear material lost. Racial bias creates terror risk. Officers' assumptions. Aid nuclear smugglers. West Coast on alert after security breach. The Department of Defense mobilized additional resources. Strategic command centers. Activated nuclear response teams. Deployed radiation monitoring. Expanded military police. Mobilized border security, enhanced naval assets, repositioned air support. Scrambled Wilson's police union representative arrived, looking grim. This goes beyond departmental discipline. We're looking at federal charges. National security has been compromised. Criminal negligence at minimum. Career in law enforcement is over. Possible conspiracy charges pending. International incident created. The Department of Homeland Security raised the national threat level to red. Every radiation detector from Canada to Mexico screamed to life as the nuclear materials moved through major population centers, creating a deadly game of cat and mouse. Across the Pacific Northwest, inside the main command center, Marcus coordinated with multiple agencies as threat assessments poured in. The massive display wall showed radiation signatures spreading like a virus through Seattle's transportation. Network, 3 distinct radiation patterns confirmed, reported Agent Chen, highlighting movement patterns. Primary target using public transit, secondary package on light rail, third signature in ride-share vehicles. They're exploiting civilian infrastructure. The tracking screens painted a grim picture. Target 1, downtown Seattle corridor target. 2, approaching Tacoma port target. 3, moving towards SeaTac, multiple decoy signatures. Active civilian transports compromised. Public spaces potentially exposed, mass evacuation protocols, initiated emergency services, mobilizing hospital networks, alerted containment zones, established. Assistant Director Chen addressed the crisis team. What started as one officer's prejudice has evolved into a potential catastrophic event. These materials are now moving through heavily populated areas. Our containment options are severely limited by civilian presence. The Environmental Impact Team reported radiation levels still contained, but mobile. Military-grade shielding detected. Multiple exposure risks if breached. Civilian monitoring stations activated. Air quality sensors deployed. Water supply being tested. Emergency protocols in place. Wilson sat in the corner, watching dozens of screens track the chaos he'd created. His face grew paler with each update as the magnitude of his actions became clear. "I was just trying to be careful," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "How was I supposed to know?" "Know what?" Marcus interrupted, turning from his station. "That Filipino Americans might be federal agents? That your prejudice would help nuclear terrorists? That your assumptions about what FBI agents look like would endanger millions?" Emergency response teams mobilized across the region, hazmat units deploying to key locations, radiation detection teams spreading out, emergency medical stations preparing, evacuation routes being planned, safe zones being established, military support moving in, international assistance arriving. Border security, heightened maritime patrols, increased air surveillance expanded. The news networks ran constant updates. Breaking, nuclear terror alert expanded, FBI manhunt continues after security breach. Officers' bias creates nuclear crisis. West Coast cities face radiological threat. Mass evacuations being considered. Social media amplified public fear. Iran nuclear emergency trending nationwide. Now Wilson effect reaching millions. Bias endangers cities, spreading globally. Prejudice kills going viral. Evacuation alert growing rapidly. Marcus coordinated with emergency services. All hospitals need radiation protocols active. Evacuation routes must avoid hot zones. Civilian panic needs containment. Track every radiation signature. Monitor social media for suspicious chatter. Prepare mass decontamination sites. Set up emergency command posts. Federal updates flooded in. President briefed on situation. Congress entering emergency session. Pentagon deploying additional assets. CIA tracking international connections. NSA monitoring all communications. State Department alerting allies. FEMA implementing crisis protocols. The command center's main screen showed population density maps overlaid with radiation signatures. Red dots moved through the densest areas, each representing a potential catastrophe. "They're using our own infrastructure against us," Marcus observed grimly. Public transit, ride shares, delivery vehicles, everything we depend on daily is now a potential threat vector. Wilson's police union representative arrived with more bad news. Federal charges being prepared. National security implications. Expanding. Criminal negligence charges likely. International incident created. Career definitely over. Potential conspiracy charges. Civil liability massive. Part 6. Far fall 950 characters. The Joint Terrorism Task Force declared a Level 1 emergency as radiation signatures spread through Seattle's transit system. Marcus watched from the command center as red dots multiplied across the city map, each representing a potential nuclear catastrophe. They're splitting the material further, he reported, tracking multiple signals. What started as 3 packages is now 7 distinct signatures. They're using our own transportation network like a shell game. The tactical display showed expanding threats. 4 signatures in downtown Seattle, 2 moving through Tacoma, 1 approaching SeaTac Airport. Multiple decoys confirmed public transit. Compromised rideshare networks, infected delivery routes, contaminated. Emergency services stretched, containment zones, breached civilian exposure possible. Assistant Director Chen coordinated with federal response teams. Every available radiation detector deployed. Track all public transportation. Monitor rideshare networks. Check delivery vehicles. Screen emergency vehicles. Search private transport. Establish containment perimeters. Wilson's actions had created unprecedented challenges. Nuclear, material dispersed, civilian infrastructure compromised, multiple jurisdictions involved, international borders threatened, terror networks, activated security protocols, breached response times, critical public safety, endangered mass evacuation needed. Resources overwhelmed emergency services mobilized across the region. Hospitals preparing radiation units, evacuation routes designated safe zones, established military support deployed, hazmat teams positioned, decontamination sites ready, emergency shelters opened, medical supplies stockpiled, transportation rerouted. Security checkpoints activated. Marcus coordinated the expanding response. We need real-time tracking of every public bus. Monitor all light rail stations. Check every rideshare vehicle. Screen delivery trucks. Track suspicious movement. Patterns. Watch for radiation clustering. Identity potential target zones. News coverage intensified nationwide. Nuclear crisis expands in Pacific Northwest. FBI tracks dispersed nuclear material. Officers prejudice, aides terror plot. Cities face radiological threat. Mass evacuation plans prepared. Social media. Amplified public concern. Nuclear crisis trending globally. To Seattle evacuation spreading June. Wilson effect viral worldwide. To prejudice aids terror growing. To bias endangers cities exploding international. Response accelerated. Canadian forces deploying Mexican borders, secured Pacific Fleet, mobilized Asian ports, monitoring European support, offered global networks activated intelligence sharing enhanced. The command center screened, showed civilian panic building, traffic jams at city exits, public transit, overloaded emergency services, swamped hospitals reaching capacity supplies running short. Communication networks strained, social order threatening. To break, Wilson watched the chaos unfold, his career and freedom evaporating with each update. His police union representative delivered more bad news. Federal prosecutors building case, national security charges pending. Criminal negligence confirmed. International incident growing. Civil lawsuits inevitable. Career officially terminated. Personal liability extensive. The National Counter-Terrorism Center activated its highest alert level as Seattle descended into controlled chaos. Every screen in the command bunker tracked radiation signatures moving through the city like a deadly web. Marcus coordinated with multiple agencies as the situation grew more complex by the minute. 7 distinct signatures now confirmed, he reported, highlighting movement patterns on the main display. They're using every form of public transportation to mask their movements: buses, trains, ride shares, even emergency vehicles. Assistant Director Chen studied the expanding threat matrix. They planned for this. The moment Wilson's prejudice compromised our operation, they activated a pre-planned dispersal strategy. Every civilian vehicle becomes potential cover. Tactical screens showed radiation patterns spreading systematically, primary package splitting into smaller components, secondary signatures in multiple transit corridors, tertiary readings in emergency response vehicles, decoy signatures appearing. Across the city grid, hotspots developing in populated areas, radiation exposure minimal but mobile, reported the hazmat team. Military-grade shielding still intact, but if they decide to breach containment, Marcus interrupted, they won't. Not yet. They're using our infrastructure against us. Every bus, train, and ambulance becomes a potential carrier. We can't shut down civilian transport without creating panic. Emergency response teams mobilized across the region. Hospitals preparing radiation treatment centers, evacuation routes being planned and secured, safe zones established in outer districts, military support moving into position, international assistance. Arriving at borders, the news networks ran constant updates. Nuclear crisis expands, 7 packages confirmed. FBI tracks dispersed materials through city. Officers' bias creates unprecedented threat. Seattle faces multiple radiation risks. Social media amplified public fears as leaked footage spread. Nuclear nightmare trending globally. Wilson effect, reaching millions. Bias endangers cities, spreading worldwide. Prejudice kills, going viral. Chen coordinated with federal response teams. Track every vehicle, showing radiation signatures. Monitor all. Public transportation networks, screen emergency response vehicles, check delivery routes, establish containment perimeters. Wilson's police union representative arrived with updated charges. Federal prosecutors building case for criminal negligence. National security implications expanding. International incident created. Civil liability massive. Emergency. Services reported growing strain. Hospitals reaching capacity, evacuation routes, congested safe zones overcrowded, military support, delayed international assistance, complicated. Marcus directed tactical response. Focus on high-density areas. Track radiation patterns, monitor suspicious movements, identity potential targets, prepare for mass evacuation. The President authorized additional measures. Military units deployed to urban centers, radiation detection expanded nationwide, special forces teams mobilized, air defense systems engaged. Maritime patrols enhanced. The command center screens showed civilian panic building. Traffic jams at city exits, public transit overloaded, emergency services swamped, hospitals reaching capacity, supplies running short. Wilson watched helplessly as his career and freedom evaporated. His union representative delivered more bad news. Federal charges being prepared, national security case building, criminal negligence confirmed, international incident growing. Marcus coordinated emergency response. All hospitals activate radiation protocols. Evacuation routes avoid hot zones. Contain civilian panic. Track radiation signatures. Monitor social media. Prepare decontamination sites. Federal. Updates flooded in. President briefed on situation. Congress entering emergency session. Pentagon deploying assets. CIA tracking international connections. NSA monitoring communications. State Department alerting allies. The FBI's National Operations Center activated Crisis Protocol Alpha as radiation signatures multiplied across Seattle's grid. Marcus watched the tactical display as 7 nuclear signatures pulsed through the city's transportation network like a deadly spider web. "They're using our evacuation protocols against us," Marcus noted, pointing to the pattern emerging on screen. "Every time we clear a sector, they move materials through the empty corridors. They're exploiting our own safety measures." Assistant Director Chen studied the evolving threat matrix. Evacuation creating opportunities for movement. Each safety corridor becomes a potential transport route. They're turning our precautions into their advantage. The command center screens displayed expanding patterns. Nuclear signatures moving through cleared zones, radiation readings following evacuation routes, hotspots developing in emergency corridors, contamination spreading through safe passages. Civilian movement creating coverage. Wilson watched from detention as his prejudice-driven mistake amplified. "I just wanted to be thorough," he muttered. "How could checking one ID cause all this?" "Because bias makes us blind," Marcus responded, not looking up from his screens. "Your assumptions about what FBI agents look like just help terrorists weaponize our own emergency protocols." The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly. 9 radiation signatures now active, multiple decoy readings confirmed transportation networks, compromised emergency routes, contaminated evacuation corridors, unsafe. Safe zones potentially exposed, civilian. Movement restricted, response teams compromised. Chen coordinated with emergency services. Revise evacuation protocols immediately. Establish new containment corridors. Reroute civilian movement patterns. Update safe zone locations. Modify emergency response routes. Enhance radiation screening. News networks broadcast continuous updates. Nuclear crisis worsens. 9 packages active. Evacuation routes compromised by terror plot. FBI struggles to contain. Spreading threat. Seattle emergency measures exploited. City infrastructure turned against population. Social media tracked public reaction. Seattle crisis trending nationwide. Nuclear evacuation spreading globally. Wilson effect reaching millions. Bias aids, terror, viral worldwide. Emergency fail growing. Rapidly, the president authorized enhanced measures. Military taking control of evacuation. Special forces deploying in city air support, monitoring movement. Maritime units securing ports. Ground forces establishing cordons. Federal agencies coordinating. Response. International Assistance Integrated Emergency Services reported critical status. Hospital systems overwhelmed evacuation routes, compromised safe zones, potentially exposed military support, delayed civilian panic, increasing resources, critically low communication networks, strained. Marcus directed tactical operations. Track every radiation signature. Monitor all civilian movement. Screen emergency vehicles. Secure transportation corridors. Update containment protocols. Revise evacuation plans. Coordinate response teams. Wilson's charges expanded hourly. Federal terrorism charges pending, national security case building, criminal negligence confirmed, international incident growing, civil liability increasing, career permanently ended, freedom seriously threatened. Command center tracked deteriorating conditions. Traffic gridlock at checkpoints, public transit systems failing, emergency services overwhelmed, hospitals reaching capacity, supplies critically short, communication networks overloaded, social order weakening. Federal updates continued arriving. President declaring national emergency. Congress authorizing special powers. Pentagon deploying additional forces. CIA tracking international connections. NSA monitoring all communications. State Department coordinating allies. FEMA expanding crisis response. Marcus coordinated with international partners. Canadian forces securing northern border. Mexican authorities monitoring south. Pacific Fleet interdicting vessels. Asian ports on high alert. European agencies tracking connections. Global intelligence sharing activated. International response coordinated. The tactical screens showed expanding threats, nuclear materials continuing to move radiation signatures, multiplying civilian infrastructure, compromised emergency systems, exploited. Transportation networks weaponized response protocols, undermined containment measures failing. The Joint Special Operations Command took control of Seattle's crisis response as nuclear signatures increased to 11 distinct sources. The command bunker's screens showed radiation patterns spreading through the city's emergency infrastructure like a metastasizing cancer. "They're adapting faster than we can respond," Marcus reported, tracking multiple signatures. "Every countermeasure we implement becomes their next opportunity. They're using our own emergency protocols as their playbook." Assistant Director Chen surveyed the tactical display. "They're turning our response against us. Each evacuation creates new transport corridors. Every emergency vehicle becomes potential cover. Our safety measures are their escape routes." The situation boards showed critical developments. 11 radiation signatures confirmed active multiple. Decoy readings complicating response. Emergency infrastructure fully compromised. Evacuation routes turned transport corridors. Safe zones becoming potential targets. Civilian movement creating coverage. Response teams possibly infiltrated. Wilson watched helplessly as his actions amplified. "I thought I was protecting the city." Just wanted to verify his credentials. How could one mistake cause this? All these people at risk because prejudice has consequences, Marcus cut in. Your assumptions about what FBI agents look like just help terrorists weaponize our entire emergency response system. The tactical situation escalated rapidly, nuclear signatures continuing to multiply, radiation patterns following response routes, emergency corridors compromised systematically, safe zones showing contamination risk, civilian evacuation creating vulnerabilities, response teams potentially exposed, containment measures failing regularly, military command, authorized extreme measures. Special forces deploying throughout city, air support, monitoring all movement, maritime units securing waterways, ground forces establishing cordons, federal agencies taking direct control, international assistance integrated fully, emergency powers activated completely, news networks broadcast constant updates. Nuclear crisis expands, 11 sources active. Emergency response system compromised. FBI struggles against adaptive terror threat. Seattle infrastructure weaponized. Military takes control of city response. Social media tracked public reaction. Seattle emergency trending globally. Nuclear nightmare. Spreading worldwide. Maca-Wilson effect, reaching millions. Bias aids terror viral internationally. Emergency chaos. Growing rapidly. Emergency services reported critical status. Hospital systems near collapse. Evacuation routes fully compromised, safe zones. Showing radiation risk, military support facing delays. Civilian panic approaching critical resources. Depleted critically communication networks. Failing Marcus coordinated tactical response. Track every radiation signature. Monitor all emergency vehicles. Screen response team movements. Secure remaining safe zones. Update containment protocols. Revise evacuation procedures. Coordinate military support. Federal updates streamed continuously. President expanding emergency powers. Congress authorizing military control. Pentagon deploying strategic assets. CIA tracking international links. NSA monitoring all communications, State Department alerting allies, FEMA expanding crisis protocols, the command center tracked deteriorating conditions. Traffic systems completely gridlocked, public transit fully compromised, emergency services overwhelmed totally, hospitals beyond capacity limits, supplies critically depleted, communication networks strained, social order severely threatened. Wilson's charges grew more serious. Federal terrorism charges pending. National security case expanding. Criminal negligence confirmed. International incident growing. Civil liability increasing. Career permanently destroyed. Freedom seriously threatened. Part 10. 49 and 50 characters. The National Security Council declared Seattle a Level 1 crisis zone as nuclear signatures increased to 13 active sources. The command center's screens showed radiation patterns now infiltrating emergency response networks across 3 states. "They're escalating beyond our containment capacity," Marcus reported, tracking multiple threats. Every emergency response vehicle becomes a potential carrier. They've turned our entire infrastructure into their distribution network. The situation: boards displayed critical updates. 13 radiation signatures confirmed, multiple decoy signals complicating response. Emergency systems completely compromised, evacuation routes serving as transport corridors. Safe zones potentially contaminated. Civilian movement patterns exploited, response teams possibly infiltrated, containment measures systematically failing. Assistant Director Chen coordinated with military command. Special forces deployed in all sectors. Air support tracking vehicle movements. Maritime units securing waterways. Ground forces establishing cordons. Federal agencies assuming control. International assistance integrated. Emergency powers fully activated. Wilson watched. From detention as casualties mounted. "I was trying to protect people. Just wanted to verify credentials. How could bias cause this? The city's dying because you couldn't believe a Filipino man might be FBI," Marcus finished. "Your prejudice just gave terrorists control of our entire emergency response network." The tactical situation deteriorated further. Nuclear materials spreading systematically, radiation patterns following response routes, emergency corridors completely compromised, safe zones showing increasing contamination, civilian evacuation creating new vulnerabilities, response teams facing potential exposure, containment measures failing regularly, infrastructure increasingly weaponized, military response expanded rapidly, special forces conducting urban operations, air assets monitoring all, movement naval units securing port access, ground forces establishing security zones, federal agencies coordinating response, international assistance deploying emergency protocols, activated fully news networks, broadcast continuous updates, nuclear. Crisis expands, 13 sources active. Emergency response system fully compromised. FBI struggles against adaptive terror network. Seattle infrastructure completely weaponized. Military assuming direct control of response. Social media tracked. Public panic. Seattle dying trending globally. Nuclear nightmare spreading worldwide. Wilson effect reaching millions. Bias aids terror viral internationally. Emergency chaos. Growing exponentially. Emergency services reported critical failure. Hospital. Systems collapsing. Evacuation routes compromised. Safe zones. Contaminated military support. Delayed civilian panic. Critical resources. Depleted communications. Failing. Marcus coordinated tactical operations. Track every radiation signature. Monitor all emergency vehicles. Screen response team movements. Secure remaining safe zones. Update containment protocols. Revise evacuation procedures. Coordinate military support. Federal updates arrived continuously. President declaring martial law. Congress authorizing military control. Pentagon deploying strategic assets. CIA tracking international connections. NSA monitoring all communications. State Department alerting allies. FEMA expanding crisis response. The command is center track system collapse. Traffic networks gridlocked. Public transit compromised. Emergency services overwhelmed. Hospitals beyond capacity. Supplies depleted. Communications failing. Social order threatened. Wilson's charges expanded hourly. Federal terrorism charges filed. National security case growing. Criminal negligence confirmed. International incident expanding. Civil liability increasing. Career permanently ended. Freedom seriously threatened. The Department of Defense activated its highest alert level as nuclear signatures increased to 15 active sources. The crisis expanded beyond Seattle, with radiation patterns now detected in Portland and Vancouver. We're losing control of the entire Pacific Northwest, Marcus reported, tracking multiple threats. They're using the evacuation panic to move materials across state lines and international borders. The situation boards displayed critical developments. 15 radiation signatures confirmed. Cross-border movement detected. 3 major cities. Compromised international incident. Expanding emergency systems. Weaponized safe zones. Systematically breached response teams. Potentially infiltrated containment measures. Failing Assistant Director Chen coordinated with international partners. Canadian forces mobilizing north. Mexican authorities securing south. Pacific Fleet deploying assets. Asian ports on high alert. European agencies tracking connections. Global intelligence sharing activated. International response coordinated. Wilson watched from his cell as the crisis expanded. One moment of prejudice. Just checking credentials. How could bias do this? 3 cities dying because you couldn't see past race, Marcus interrupted. Your assumptions about FBI agents just gave terrorists control of the entire Pacific coast. The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly. Nuclear materials crossing borders, radiation patterns following evacuation routes, emergency corridors compromised internationally, safe zones showing contamination risk, civilian movement creating vulnerabilities, response teams facing exposure, containment measures failing systematically, infrastructure weaponized. Across regions, military response expanded internationally, special forces operating across borders, air assets tracking cross-border movement, naval units securing coastal waters, ground forces establishing regional cordons, federal agencies coordinating internationally, global assistance deploying rapidly, emergency protocols activated multinationally, news networks broadcast constant updates. Nuclear crisis expands, 15 sources active, 3 major cities face nuclear threat. FBI struggles against international terror network. Pacific Northwest infrastructure compromised. Military taking control of 3-state region. Social media tracked growing panic. Pacific Northwest crisis trending globally. Nuclear nightmare spreading worldwide. Wilson effect reaching millions. Bias aids. Terror viral internationally. Regional emergency, growing exponentially, emergency services reported. Critical status, hospital systems collapsing regionally. Evacuation routes compromised across states, safe zones contaminated in 3 cities. Military support facing delays. Civilian panic spreading rapidly. Resources depleted critically. Communications failing systematically. Marcus coordinated multinational response. Track cross-border radiation signatures. Just monitor international emergency vehicles. Screen multinational response teams. Secure remaining regional safe zones. Update international containment protocols. Revise cross-border evacuation procedures. Coordinate global military support. Federal updates streamed continuously, President declaring regional emergency. Congress authorizing international action, Pentagon deploying continental assets, CIA coordinating global response, NSA monitoring international communications, UD, State Department managing diplomatic crisis. FEMA expanding multi-state protocols. The command center tracked system collapse. Regional traffic networks failing, international transit compromised, emergency services overwhelmed, hospitals beyond capacity, supplies critically depleted, communications deteriorating, social order threatened regionally. Wilson's charges expanded internationally. Federal terrorism charges filed. International security case growing. Criminal negligence confirmed globally. Diplomatic incident expanding. Civil liability increasing exponentially. Career permanently destroyed. Freedom seriously threatened. The Pentagon activated Strategic Command as nuclear signatures increased to 17 active sources. The crisis now threatened the entire West Coast, with radiation patterns detected from San Diego to Alaska. They've turned our prejudice into a weapon of mass destruction, Marcus reported, tracking multiple threats. Wilson's bias gave them the opening they needed to compromise the entire Pacific Defense Network. The situation boards displayed critical updates. 17 radiation signatures, active West Coast, fully compromised, international borders breached. Defense networks infiltrated emergency systems, weaponized safe zones, systematically contaminated. Response teams potentially compromised, containment measures failing completely. Assistant Director Chen coordinated with Strategic Command. Nuclear response teams activated. Strategic forces deploying coastwide. International borders under surveillance. Maritime defense networks engaged. Air defense systems activated. Ground forces establishing cordons. Emergency powers fully implemented. Wilson watched from military custody as destruction spread. One moment of assumption, just checking his identity. How could prejudice cause this? The coast is dying because you couldn't believe a Filipino man might be FBI, Marcus finished. Your bias just compromised national security from Mexico to Canada. The tactical situation deteriorated critically. Nuclear materials spreading, coast-wide radiation patterns following defense routes, emergency corridors, compromised completely safe zones, showing critical contamination, civilian evacuation, creating vulnerabilities, response teams facing critical exposure, containment measures systematically failing, infrastructure weaponized continentally, military response expanded strategically, special forces operating coast-wide, air assets tracking continental movement, naval units securing Pacific waters, ground forces establishing coastal cordons, federal agencies coordinating continentally, international assistance deploying rapidly, emergency protocols activated strategically, news networks broadcast, continuous updates, nuclear crisis expands, 17 sources active, West Coast faces critical nuclear threat, FBI struggles against continental terror network, Pacific defense infrastructure compromised, military taking control of coastal region, social media tracked mass panic, chatter West Coast crisis trending globally, nuclear nightmare spreading worldwide, the Wilson effect reaching millions, bias aids, terror viral internationally, coastal emergency growing exponentially, emergency services reported. Critical collapse. Hospital systems failing, coast-wide evacuation routes compromised completely, safe zones contaminated continentally, military support facing critical delays, civilian panic approaching chaos, resources depleted critically, communications failing systematically. Marcus coordinated strategic response, track coastal radiation signatures, monitor defense infrastructure, screen continental response teams, secure remaining strategic zones, update defense containment protocols, Revise coastal evacuation procedures. Coordinate international support. Federal updates streamed. Continuously, President declaring coastal emergency. Congress authorizing strategic response. Pentagon activating defense assets. CIA coordinating international effort. NSA monitoring continental communications. State Department managing Pacific crisis. FEMA expanding coastal protocols. The command center tracked systemic collapse, coastal infrastructure failing, continental transit, compromised emergency services, overwhelmed hospitals beyond capacity supplies, critically depleted communications, deteriorating social order, threatened coastwide. Declared the entire West Coast a national defense emergency zone as nuclear signatures increased to 19 active sources. Radiation patterns now threatened major population centers from Los Angeles to Vancouver. They've weaponized our entire coastal infrastructure, Marcus reported, tracking multiple threats. What started with one officer's prejudice has compromised national security across 3 countries. The situation boards displayed critical status. 19 radiation signatures active. 3 countries directly threatened major cities facing contamination, defense networks, compromised, emergency systems, weaponized, safe zones, systematically breached, response teams, potentially infected containment. Measures critically failing. Assistant Director Chen coordinated with command. Strategic forces deployed coastwide. International borders under surveillance. Maritime defense networks engaged. Air defense systems activated. Ground forces establishing cordons. Emergency powers fully implemented. Continental response coordinated. Wilson watched. From military detention as chaos spread, one moment of bias. Just checking identity. How could prejudice do this? 3 countries threatened because you couldn't believe a Filipino man might be FBI, Marcus stated. Your assumptions just compromised continental security from Mexico to Canada. The tactical situation deteriorated further. Nuclear materials spreading internationally, radiation patterns following defense routes, emergency corridors completely compromised safe zones showing critical contamination, civilian evacuation creating vulnerabilities, response teams facing lethal exposure, containment measures systematically failing. Infrastructure weaponized continentally, military response expanded dramatically, special forces operating internationally, air assets tracking continental movement, naval units securing Pacific waters, ground forces establishing coastal cordons, federal agencies coordinating globally, international assistance deploying rapidly, emergency protocols activated strategically, news networks broadcast continuous. Updates, nuclear crisis expands, 19 sources active, 3 nations face critical nuclear threat, FBI struggles against international terror network, Pacific defense infrastructure compromised, military taking control of coastal regions, social. Media tracked growing panic, Dangerous continental crisis trending globally, nuclear nightmare spreading worldwide, Wilson effect reaching millions, bias aids, terror viral internationally, coastal emergency growing exponentially, emergency services reported critical status, hospital systems failing, coast-wide evacuation routes compromised completely, safe zones contaminated continentally, military support facing delays, civilian panic approaching chaos, resources depleted critically, communications failing systematically. Marcus. Coordinated strategic response. Track international radiation signatures. Monitor defense infrastructure. Screen continental response teams. Secure remaining strategic zones. Update defense containment protocols. Revise coastal evacuation procedures. Coordinate international support. The United Nations Security Council declared an international crisis as nuclear signatures increased to 21 active sources. The threat now extended across the Pacific Rim, with radiation patterns detected in major ports from Tokyo to Singapore. They've turned our coastal prejudice into a global weapon, Marcus reported, monitoring threats. Wilson's bias gave them access to international shipping networks. Every port that received vessels from Seattle is now compromised. The situation. Boards displayed critical updates. 21 radiation signatures active, Pacific Rim nations threatened major ports facing contamination. Global shipping compromised emergency systems, weaponized safe zones, systematically breached response teams. Potentially infected containment measures critically failing, Assistant Director Chen coordinated global response. Strategic forces deployed Pacific-wide. International shipping under surveillance. Maritime defense networks engaged. Air defense systems activated. Ground forces establishing cordons. Emergency powers implemented globally. International response coordinated. Wilson watched. From maximum security as devastation spread. One moment of assumption. Just checking credentials. How could bias do this? The Pacific Rim threatened because you couldn't believe a Filipino man might be FBI, Marcus interrupted. Your prejudice just compromised security across the entire Pacific Ocean. The tactical situation deteriorated internationally. Nuclear materials spreading globally, radiation patterns following shipping routes, emergency corridors completely compromised safe zones, showing critical contamination, civilian evacuation creating vulnerabilities. Response teams facing lethal exposure containment, measures systematically failing, infrastructure weaponized internationally, military response expanded globally, special forces operating across Pacific air assets tracking international, movement naval units securing ocean shipping lanes, ground forces establishing port cordons, federal agencies coordinating globally, international assistance, deploying rapidly emergency protocols, activated worldwide news networks, broadcast continuous updates, nuclear crisis expands, 21 sources active, Pacific Rim nations face nuclear threat, FBI struggles against global terror network, international shipping infrastructure compromised, military taking control of Pacific ports, social, media tracked international panic. Pacific crisis trending globally. Nuclear nightmare spreading worldwide. Wilson effect reaching millions. Bias aids. Terror viral internationally. Global emergency growing exponentially. Emergency services reported. Critical collapse. Hospital systems failing internationally. Evacuation routes compromised completely. Safe zones contaminated globally. Military support facing critical delays. Civilian panic approaching chaos. Resources depleted critically. Communications failing systematically. Marcus coordinated international response. Track global radiation signatures. And monitor shipping infrastructure. Screen international response teams. Secure remaining strategic ports. Update global containment protocols, revise evacuation procedures, coordinate multinational support. The World Health Organization declared a global health emergency as nuclear signatures increased to 23 active sources. Radiation patterns now threaten population centers across Asia, with contamination detected from Hong Kong to Seoul. They've weaponized the entire Pacific trade network, Marcus reported, tracking multiple threats. What started with one officer's prejudice in Seattle has compromised health security across Asia. Every major port that received shipments is now showing radiation signatures. The situation boards displayed critical status. 23 radiation signatures active. Asian population centers threatened major cities facing contamination. Global trade networks compromised, health systems overwhelmed, safe zones systematically breached. Medical teams potentially exposed, containment measures critically failing international borders. compromised trade routes, weaponized civilian populations at risk, emergency response, overwhelmed Assistant Director Chen coordinated global response. Medical response teams deployed worldwide, international borders under quarantine, health networks fully engaged, air medical evacuation activated, ground teams establishing cordons, emergency powers implemented globally, international response coordinated, maritime quarantine established, air traffic restrictions implemented, ground transportation controlled, civilian movement restricted, military support expanded. Wilson watched from isolation as devastation spread. One moment of bias. Just checking credentials. How could prejudice do this? The world threatened because I couldn't believe an FBI agent. My assumptions caused this, everything falling apart. All from one moment. Because you couldn't believe a Filipino man might be FBI, Marcus stated. Your assumptions just compromised global health. Security. Now we're facing potential contamination across the entire Pacific Rim. The tactical situation deteriorated globally. Nuclear materials spreading internationally, radiation patterns following trade routes, medical corridors completely compromised, safe zones showing critical contamination, civilian evacuation creating vulnerabilities, response teams facing lethal exposure. Containment measures systematically failing infrastructure weaponized globally. Transportation networks infected, communication systems, compromised emergency services, overwhelmed military resources, stretched thin. Health response expanded internationally. Medical teams operating across Asia, air assets tracking contamination, spread naval units securing shipping lanes, ground forces establishing medical cordons, health agencies coordinating globally, international assistance deploying rapidly emergency protocols, activated worldwide quarantine zones, established treatment centers, overwhelmed medical supplies, depleted staff exposure, increasing resources critically low. The UN General Assembly declared an international state of emergency as nuclear signatures increased to 25 active sources. Radiation patterns now threatened major population centers worldwide, with contamination detected across 4 continents. The crisis has gone global, Marcus reported, tracking worldwide threats. What began with one officer's prejudice in Seattle now threatens international stability. Every major shipping hub worldwide shows radiation signatures, and the patterns suggest they're adapting faster than we can respond. The situation boards displayed critical status. 25 radiation signatures, active global population centers, threatened international trade, compromised world health systems, overwhelmed safe zones, systematically breached medical teams critically, exposed containment measures, failing globally. International borders, compromised trade routes, weaponized worldwide, civilian populations endangered, emergency response collapsed, military resources, depleted communication networks, failing transportation. Systems compromised, economic systems, destabilizing social order, threatening collapse. Assistant Director Chen coordinated global response. International response teams deployed. Now global borders under quarantine, health networks critically engaged, air evacuation systems activated, ground teams establishing cordons, emergency powers implemented, world response coordinated, maritime quarantine expanded, air restrictions tightened, ground transport controlled, civilian movement restricted, military support maximized, economic measures activated, social controls implemented, resource distribution managed. Wilson watched from maximum security as global chaos unfolded. One moment of bias, just checking credentials. How could prejudice? The world collapsing because I couldn't believe an FBI agent. My assumptions caused this. Everything falling apart. All from one decision. Nations threatened because civilization at risk from today, global stability compromised. Humanity endangered by because you couldn't believe a Filipino man might be FBI, Marcus stated grimly. Your prejudice has triggered potential global catastrophe. The entire world faces nuclear contamination because of one biased assumption. Every continent now faces unprecedented threats because you couldn't see past race. The tactical situation deteriorated internationally. Nuclear materials spreading globally, radiation patterns following trade routes, medical corridors completely breached safe zones, critically contaminated civilian evacuation creating chaos, response teams facing casualties, containment measures failing, infrastructure weaponized globally, transportation networks infected, communication systems collapsed, emergency services overwhelmed, military resources exhausted, economic systems failing, social order deteriorating, government control weakening, international cooperation strained, global response expanded critically. Medical teams operating worldwide, air assets tracking contamination, naval units securing shipping ground forces, establishing cordons, agencies coordinating globally, international assistance, deploying emergency protocols, activated quarantine zones, established treatment centers overwhelmed, medical supplies, depleted staff, casualties, mounting resources critically failed, economic measures implemented, social controls, activated government authority, reinforced cooperation frameworks, stressed news networks, broadcast continuous updates. Global crisis, 25 nuclear sources active. World health systems face collapse, international trade networks compromised, military forces struggle to contain threat. Economic systems show critical strain. Social order threatens to break down. Governments implement emergency powers. International cooperation under pressure. Social media tracked worldwide panic. Just global crisis trending universally. Nuclear nightmare reaching billions. Wilson effect viral globally. Bias endangers world. Spreading rapidly. Humanity threatened growing exponentially, worldwide emergency dominating platforms, civilization at risk trending everywhere, global collapse gaining momentum. The International Atomic Energy Agency declared a global nuclear emergency as signatures increased to 27 active sources. Radiation patterns now threaten civilization itself, with contamination detected on every inhabited continent. Global monitoring systems showed nuclear materials spreading through transportation networks at an unprecedented rate. We're facing potential societal collapse, Marcus reported, tracking worldwide threats. What started with one officer's prejudice has escalated into an extinction-level event. The nuclear materials are now spreading through every major transportation network globally. Our containment measures are failing faster than we can implement them. The situation boards displayed critical status as red warning lights flashed. Across multiple screens, 27 radiation signatures active and multiplying, global civilization threatened by expanding contamination, international systems compromised beyond recovery, world infrastructure overwhelmed and failing, safe zones completely breached and unusable, response teams critically exposed and casualties mounting. Containment measures failed globally without backup. International borders collapsed and uncontrollable trade networks weaponized against humanity. Survival threatened in major population centers. Emergency systems failed beyond capacity. Military resources exhausted and ineffective. Economic systems collapsed worldwide. Social order disintegrating rapidly. Government control failing in multiple. Nation civilization approaching irreversible breakdown. Assistant Director Chen coordinated what could be humanity's final response. Global response teams deployed to critical zones. International borders sealed against further spread. Infrastructure networks secured where possible. Air systems locked down completely. Ground teams establishing final cordons. Emergency powers maximized in all regions. World response coordinated through remaining channels. Maritime routes quarantined with naval forces. Air traffic grounded internationally. Ground transport frozen in contaminated areas. Civilian movement halted in major cities. Military control established over vital resources. Economic systems suspended to prevent panic. Social controls implemented for survival. Government authority consolidated for efficiency. International cooperation enforced through necessity. Wilson watched from deep bunker isolation as humanity faced potential extinction. The weight of his actions crushed him as updates streamed in constantly. One moment of prejudice changed everything. Just checking identity ended civilization. How could bias threaten humanity? The world dying because I couldn't believe. My assumptions doomed billions. Everything we built collapsing, all from one biased choice. World ending because I wouldn't listen. Civilization crumbling from prejudice. Human extinction possible from assumption. All life threatened by discrimination. The end of humanity from bias. Because you couldn't believe a Filipino man might be FBI, Marcus stated grimly as radiation levels spiked again. Your prejudice may have triggered human extinction. Our entire species faces nuclear contamination because of one biased assumption. Civilization itself is threatened because you couldn't see past race. The tactical situation deteriorated beyond recovery. Nuclear materials spreading through all continents, radiation patterns following every major transit route, medical response completely overwhelmed globally, safe zones showing critical contamination levels, civilian populations facing unprecedented exposure, response teams taking catastrophic casualties, containment measures failing in all regions, infrastructure weaponized beyond control, transportation networks completely compromised, communication systems collapsed worldwide. Emergency services ceased functioning, military resources depleted entirely, economic activity halted globally, social structures breaking down government authority, crumbling international coordination, failing humanity's final response, expanded desperately. Medical teams operating beyond capacity, air assets, tracking unstoppable spread, naval units maintaining quarantines, ground forces establishing last defenses, agencies coordinating through chaos, international assistance, overwhelming emergency protocols. Improving useless, quarantine zones breached regularly, treatment centers beyond capacity, medical supplies completely depleted, staff casualties reaching critical levels, resources exhausted without replacement, economic measures proving ineffective, social controls breaking down rapidly, government authority increasingly ignored, cooperation frameworks collapsing entirely. The World Health Organization declared a global extinction event as nuclear signatures reached 29 active sources. Radiation levels now exceeded survivable limits across major population centers, with contamination spreading through every remaining safe zone. Global monitoring systems showed nuclear materials had breached all containment protocols, turning every transportation network into a delivery system for radioactive contamination. We've lost containment completely, Marcus reported from the underground command bunker, his voice heavy with the weight of impending human extinction. What began with one officer's prejudice has triggered humanity's potential extinction. Nuclear materials have breached every quarantine zone we established. Our remaining safe zones are showing critical contamination levels. The situation boards displayed humanity's final status as red warning indicators covered every screen. 29 radiation sources active and multiplying rapidly, global population centers beyond survivable contamination limits. International containment completely breached in all regions. World health systems ceased functioning in contaminated zones. Safe zones showing lethal radiation levels and spreading response teams taking terminal casualties in all areas. Containment measures universally failed across continents. International borders effectively dissolved from contamination. Human survival timeline shortened to critical levels. Emergency response no longer possible. In most regions, military assets completely depleted and contaminated. Economic activity ceased globally as systems collapsed. Social structures collapsed entirely in affected zones. Government authority disintegrated in contaminated areas. Civilization entering terminal phase across all continents. Human extinction becoming inevitable without intervention. Assistant Director Chen coordinated humanity's final efforts from the command bunker. Remaining response teams deployed to identified survival zones. International borders irrelevant. Focus on preserving life. Infrastructure networks abandoned to contamination. Air systems completely compromised and unsafe. Ground teams entering terminal operational phase. Emergency powers meaningless in collapsed zones. World response disintegrating as systems fail. Maritime quarantine breached in all oceans. Air traffic ceased globally due to contamination. Ground transport impossible through hot zones. Civilian casualties mounting beyond counting. Military forces collapsing from exposure. Economic systems dead as commerce stops. Social order gone in affected regions. Government authority finished in hot zones. International cooperation failed completely. Wilson watched from deep isolation as humanity faced its end, his single moment of prejudice having triggered potential extinction. One moment of bias doomed humanity. Just checking credentials ended civilization. How could prejudice threaten our species? Humanity dying because I couldn't believe. I couldn't accept a Filipino FBI agent. My assumptions doomed billions to death. Everything humanity built is ending. All from one biased choice. World dying because I wouldn't listen. Species facing extinction from prejudice. Life itself threatened by discrimination. All of humanity paying for my bias. Because you couldn't believe a Filipino man might be FBI, Marcus stated grimly as radiation levels spiked again across all monitoring stations. Your prejudice may have triggered human extinction. Our entire species faces nuclear contamination because of one biased assumption. Civilization itself is ending because you couldn't see past race. The tactical situation deteriorated beyond any hope of recovery. Nuclear materials spreading through all remaining safe zones. Radiation patterns following every survivor movement. Medical response completely overwhelmed and failing. Safe zones showing terminal contamination levels. Civilian populations facing lethal exposure rates. Response teams taking catastrophic casualties, containment measures failing in all regions, infrastructure weaponized beyond any control, transportation networks completely compromised, communication systems collapsed, worldwide emergency, services ceased functioning. Military resources depleted entirely, economic activity halted permanently, social structures breaking irreparably, government authority crumbling finally, international coordination failed totally. As the last underground bunkers succumbed to lethal radiation levels, Marcus realized all hope was lost. Humanity had no sanctuary left. No corner of the planet spared from the deadly contamination unleashed by Wilson's prejudice. In a final transmission, he declared the human species extinct, the heavy words echoing through the now empty command center. This is Assistant Director Marcus Chen, signing off for the last time. The human race has been terminated. Radiation has breached all remaining safe zones. There are no survivors. Civilization has fallen. May whatever beings find our ruins learn from our mistakes. Chen out. With that, he removed his hazmat helmet, knowing it was futile. The toxins would claim him soon enough, as they had already. Claimed billions before him. There was no point in prolonging the inevitable. Deep in isolation, a broken Wilson listened as the last radio channels went silent one by one, severed by the spreading nuclear contamination his short-sightedness had unleashed. In the oppressive stillness, he faced the consequences of his bias, a world devoid of human life, poisoned by his inability to see beyond race and nationality. Alone with his regrets, Wilson's final thoughts echoed in the emptiness. What have I done? Forgive me, I was so wrong. My prejudice doomed our species. Billions dead because I couldn't see an agent as an equal. Destroyed by my own bias. With those words, the last human voice on Earth faded into oblivion. The extinction was complete. An entire species and civilization erased by the uncontrolled spread of nuclear materials, triggered by one man's discrimination. Earth itself fell into an eerie quiet, a toxic, irradiated monument to the destructive power of human prejudice. No birdsong, no animal calls, no sounds of life remained to fill the poisoned air. Only the wailing of the wind over dead cities and the lapping of stagnant waves on contaminated shores broke the grim silence. The planet was already healing from its human infection. In the void of space, alien astronomers marked the sudden silencing of the once vibrant human radio signals. They noted the event with solemn precision, a somber reminder of the fragility of sapient life. The records of 1,000 civilizations told the same story. Prejudice, discrimination, and division inevitably led to self-destruction more often than not. It seemed humanity had succumbed to that depressingly common fate. On a cosmic scale, humanity was merely a brief spark in the infinite darkness, extinguished prematurely by its own inability to transcend the superficial differences it had created. A species that could have spread to the stars instead collapsed under the weight of its own regressive biases and tribal mentalities. The universe moved on in its steady cycles, indifferent to the loss of one more ephemeral race, a sad casualty of its failure to evolve beyond irrational hatreds. Sapience was no guarantee of wisdom, as the silent, empty Earth now attested. The Earth continued its celestial dance around the sun, barren and lifeless, with only the spreading radiation signatures to tell of humanity's bigoted downfall. The planet itself carried on, unaware and uncaring of the dramas and self-inflicted oblivion of the species that had once named itself its master. Perhaps in 1,000,000 years or 10, a new biosphere would arise from the ashes to begin nature's dance once more. But there would be no humans to record it. They had doomed themselves to an ignominious footnote in the universe's history books. One more self-extinguished candle amongst billions, a promising flame snuffed out by the implacable idiocy of prejudice. Perhaps some unfathomably distant descendant species might one day decipher humanity's fate from the ancient radiation scars and long-buried bunkers. If so, Wilson's final epitaph would serve as stark warning from the grave, to never again allow superficial bias to threaten sapient existence. Here lies humanity, a species that could have touched the stars, silenced forever by the unrelenting toxicity of discrimination. May our ashen remains forever whisper this dire warning. Bigotry is the most lethal poison any civilization can imbibe.